In this lecture, we will present the case in favor of the documentary hypothesis. Bear in mind that this isn't my view, but I'm going to present the documentary hypothesis and defend it the way that proponents of it would do so. The documentary hypothesis is built on the foundation of 5 pillars: the pillar of divine names, the pillar of language and style, the pillar of contradictions, the pillar of doublets, and the pillar of composite sections. That is the pillars on which the documentary hypothesis is built. I call this Wellhausen's temple. The first pillar is the divine names, and it goes back to the question that Ostruc raised: why do some passages in Genesis use Yahweh, while other passages in Genesis use Elohim? And the answer of the documentary hypothesis is because they come from different sources. So those that use the divine name Yahweh, that's the J source, and those that use Elohim are not J source, either P or E source is what they would say for the book of Genesis. Now, a key text that would defend this point of view is from Exodus chapter 6, verses 2 and 3. God spoke to Moses and said to him, "I am Yahweh. I appeared to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob as El Shaddai. But by my name Yahweh, I did not make myself known to them." Now, this verse seems to imply that the patriarchs did not know the name Yahweh, usually translated Lord with capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D, but rather they knew God by the title El Shaddai, which means God Almighty. And if this statement were true, then it produces a contradiction, because in many passages, the patriarchs seem to know the name Yahweh. They use it freely. And yet this passage says that they did not. This passage is understood to be part of the E source, which, in contradiction with the J source, which has the patriarchs referring to Yahweh quite frequently. Did the patriarchs know the name Yahweh? Well, none of the personal names in Genesis use the divine element Yahweh. In contrast with, from the time of Moses on, many personal names have the name Yahweh, like Joshua, Yehoshua. The Yeho part is a short form of Yahweh. Or Josiah, the ayah at the end is Yahu or Yahweh. On the other hand, many of the personal names in Genesis do use the title El, God. El means God, and you have Ishmael, which is God hears, which is a personal name. You have the place name Bet-El or Bethel, which uses the word God, but the name Yahweh does not occur. And this can be taken as evidence confirming that Yahweh was not known as a name for God during patriarchal times. So, according to Wellhausen, here I'm actually drawing from Westermann, you can go through and you can divide up the book of Genesis into passages that have a priestly source, starting with the creation account in Genesis 1, where the word Elohim is used, and it seems to be kind of a ritualistic description of creation that culminates in the Sabbath day. And then you have Genesis 5 and Genesis 6 and Genesis 9 and Genesis 10 and Genesis 11, all of which have priestly source material. But then where Yahweh is used begins in Genesis 2:5 and on through Genesis 2 and into 3. But then Genesis 4, Genesis 6, Genesis 9, 10, and 11 have sections that are Yahweh's source. And then the Elohist source doesn't begin until Genesis 15, but then you have Elohist source also in Genesis 20, 21, 22, 24, and so forth. So the first pillar is the divine name. The second pillar is language and style. The argument is this, that different sources can be identified by their distinctive use of words. Now, this has already been done with the name Yahweh, Lord, and Elohim, which is translated God. But here are some other words that are used to distinguish the sources. P, it is argued, uses bara, create, for describing creation, whereas the J source uses yatsar, which means to form, instead. And so later on, you get in Genesis 5:1 that how God created barad. Well, that's an indication that that is a P source. The word cut, in Hebrew karat, is used in the covenant language of the J source and the E source. You'll get that in Genesis 15 and verse 18. But P uses different vocabulary. Instead of karating a covenant, you hakim a covenant. You establish a covenant. And you get that in Genesis 17 and verse 4. So the difference between cutting a covenant and establishing a covenant. And other word pairs are also used to distinguish sources. Sinai versus Horeb, Canaanite versus Amorite for the same group of people. Those are all indications of source division on the basis of using distinctive vocabulary. The different sources also show different styles. In Genesis 1, you have P's account of creation. Now, P is priestly, and it's argued that, well, that account of creation is kind of ritualized. 7 days, each with an evening and a morning. P is also known for its genealogies, and so you have the genealogy of Genesis 5 is also very formulaic. And both go along well with the thesis that these are priestly in character. On the other hand, when you have J's account of creation in Genesis 2:5 through chapter 4:26, well, it comes across not as a ritual, but as a colorful drama. It is not formalistic. This brings us to the third pillar, contradictions. Different sources can be discerned on the basis of contradiction between it and other sources, either in content or in viewpoint. So in Genesis 1, P source, man is like God. Man is made in the image of God. But in Genesis 2 and 3, God is like man. He walks in the garden like a man. In Genesis 1:27, man is like God because he's made in God's image. In Genesis 3, the J source, man is not like God, but if anything, God is like man walking through the garden. And in any case, man is prevented from eating the tree in order that he would not become like one of us. And this contradictory point of view of man indicates, well, these are different sources. And then there's a different ordering between P's account of creation and J's account of creation. In Genesis 1, which is P's account, the plants are created 3 days before man was created, and animals are created on the same day, but before man. In Genesis 2, which is J's account, plants and animals are created after man. Contradictions due to different authors is the argument. The editor put together these sources and combined them But he didn't go out of his way to harmonize the contradictory accounts, but simply reproduced them both despite blatant contradictions. Fourth pillar is doublets. The term doublet refers to slightly different versions of the same story. The theory is this: the editor had various sources which told slightly variant versions of the same story. But rather than choosing one version or another version, the author included more than one version. But the similarities between the stories indicate them to be versions of the same story, only garbled through different sources. So the first example is the account of creation. You have P's account of creation in Genesis 1, but then you get the same story again with contradictions, but nonetheless the same story in Genesis chapter 2, where man is made from the dust of the earth and woman is made from man's side. Then you also have the doublet of near loss of a patriarchal wife, a matriarch, to a foreign king. And so you have Sarah in Egypt in Genesis 12, who was almost taken by Pharaoh. But then you have Sarah in Gerar in Genesis 20, who was almost taken by Abimelech. But then you have Rebecca in Gerar, who was almost taken by Abimelech in Genesis 26. And the argument is that these are not three entirely separate stories, but these are the same story told three different times, first in the J source, second in the E source, third in the P source. And when J and E and P were combined together, they kept these different versions of the same story all at the same time. That would be an example of doublets as an argument for sources. And then you come to the fifth pillar, and the fifth pillar is composite sections. Now, the problem with these composite sections, as they're called, is that they are passages that seem to freely mix the divine names. They'll refer to God as Yahweh, they'll refer to God as Elohim. You get that in the flood narrative in Genesis chapter 6 through 9. You get that in the Joseph story in Genesis 37. You get that in the blessing on Isaac in Genesis 27. And so if the divine name indicates separate sources, well, how come in these stories there's more than one divine name? They're kind of intermixed together. That looks like a problem for the JEDP documentary hypothesis theory. Well, Wellhausen came up with a solution to that. He tried to show how contradictory sources were in fact interwoven. And by this line of argument, Wellhausen was able to turn an argument against his theory into an argument in favor of his theory. And it shows the creative genius of Wellhausen. What I'm going to do is to show you some parallel passages from the flood story. One is going to be supposedly J's account. The other one is going to be P's account of the flood story. This is after Norman Habel literary criticism of the Old Testament that tries to show the two interwoven together. Now, for sake of time, I'm not going to read the entire text, but as you look at the first version, so-called, on the left, that's the Yahweh source. On the right will be the priestly account. And notice that on the left you have Yahweh. Yahweh saw the wickedness of man was great, and Yahweh said, I will destroy man whom I have created from the face of the ground. But Noah found favor in the eyes of Yahweh. But then on the right, you have an interest in genealogies. These are the genealogies of Noah. It uses the word God rather than Yahweh. Noah walked with God, and the earth was corrupt before God, and God saw the earth that it was corrupt, and God said to Noah. Again, if you go on, it says in the Yahwehist version, and Yahweh said to Noah, and has an interest in the beasts of every clean beast. You shall take to yourself 7 and 7, the male and his female, and so on and so forth. On the priestly column, you will make a ark of gopher wood, and I will establish my covenant, and every living thing of all flesh, 2 of every sort, you shall bring on the ark. And again, as we go on, Yahweh shut them in chapter 7 in the Yahwistic verses. But then in the priestly verses, there they went into the ark to Noah, 2 by 2, male and female, as God had commanded them. And those that entered, male and female, entered as God had commanded them. Yahweh versus God. Then you have after 40 days, the water increased and lifted up the ark. The priestly account speaks of 150 days. We'll come back to that in a moment. Then, as we go on, you have a section that's attributed to Yahweh. The name Yahweh isn't used, but it fits into their interpretation. On the right, you have 8:1, but God remembered Noah and all the beasts. And God caused a wind to pass over the earth, and so on and so forth. So it uses God. In chapter 8, then Noah built an altar to Yahweh and took every clean animal and every clean bird and offered burnt offerings on the altar. And Yahweh smelled the soothing aroma. And Yahweh said to himself, I'll never curse the ground on account of man again. Again, on the right, you have God blessing Noah. And God had made man, and God spoke to Noah. How does this composite section work, according to Wellhausen? He would argue, and you can test this out by going back to the accounts that I have in the slides and reading everything, first the left column and then the right column. Both stories are more or less complete in themselves. They could have existed independently until stories that are slightly different but are coherent. It does follow the divine names. The priestly account will use Elohim. The Yahwistic account will use Yahweh. And the priestly account shows the customary concerns for genealogy. The Yahwistic account doesn't have that kind of concern. The priestly account, when it refers to the covenant, it talks about establishing the covenant. And it's already been argued that that's a favorite term for making a covenant in the priestly writer, as opposed to Yahwistic sources that say cut a covenant, though that term is not used in the flood narrative. As far as contradictions, there seems to be contradictions in time. J speaks about 40 days and 40 nights and disembarking after 3 weeks, whereas in the P account, it speaks of a flood lasting about a year. There's also contradiction in theological emphasis. In P, God is a transcendent lawgiver, giving detailed instructions concerning the ark. Whereas in J, God is anthropomorphic. God sees what was going on. He is sorry for what he sees. And God smells the sacrifices. Again, describing God in very human terms, seeing things, feeling things, smelling things. And so that completes the 5th of the pillars. You have the divine name, Yahweh versus Elohim. You have differences in language and style. You have differences in terms of contradiction between the different sources. You have doublets where the same story is told more than once. And then you have composite sections, which, at least in the case of the flood story, are capable of being unraveled and reconstructed as two separate stories. Those are the 5 pillars of Wellhausen's theory. So this is the evidence for the documentary hypothesis. And it's not a weak argument. The theory does seem to explain much of the phenomena of the text. And yet, if true, it undermines the historicity of every event in the Pentateuch. To be intellectually honest, we must follow the truth wherever it leads. We can't simply ignore the case made for the documentary hypothesis. If the weight of the evidence is convincing, we're obliged as honest people to accept it, even if it means a shift in perspective. And if we are convinced, as many an evangelical Bible student has been when they went to liberal schools, most liberal scholars are not born liberals, they become one later in life, that if we are convinced, well, then we must live with the implications of this documentary hypothesis. All that we have been taught concerning the Bible's historical accuracy and infallibility would have to be abandoned. Rather, we will have to have a new view of the Bible as a book that does contain all kinds of contradictions and competing theologies rather than a unified whole. Is this the answer? Or is this theory based upon flawed premises and conclusions? We'll come back and we will discuss the alternative from a conservative point of view.